I never thought I would have an affair. Especially not at 38, with a husband, a child, and a stable job at a financial firm in central Bristol. But then, on a late afternoon in early October, as I closed the office door behind me and followed Mark into a small hotel just off Queen's Road, I knew I'd gone too far. The room on the third floor had a half-open window, curtains drawn halfway, and the faint scent of wax mixed with the warmth of 2 cappuccinos resting on the table. I wasn't trembling. I just felt fully alive, in a body that had seemed numb to such feelings for years. Mark took off his suit jacket and hung it neatly on the hook by the door. There was no rush. No unnecessary words. He moved towards me, slowly, deliberately. I stood still, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice low and gentle, but clear. I nodded. No one was forcing me. There was no scheme. No trap. It was just that. I wanted to. I wanted to know what it felt like to be touched like I mattered. To be seen with desire instead of indifference. To feel something beyond the dullness and duty of everyday life. And when Mark's lips touched mine, tender at first, then gradually more intense, I knew I had lost something. But in the same moment, I had found myself again. We made love as if it were the first time, and might well be the last. There was no time for pretending. No room for hesitation. Everything poured out, too fast for regret, too deep for reason. Later, as I lay on the bed, hair tousled, lips swollen, my crumpled white blouse draped over the arm of the chair, Mark held my hand, saying nothing. For the first time in years, I felt alive. "My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 38 years old, and I live with my husband and son in the northern suburbs of Bristol, where the maples cast golden shadows in autumn, and Saturday afternoons are usually for supermarket trips or coffee with neighbors. I've worked in finance for over 12 years, currently as a senior associate at a mid-sized strategy consultancy. The job requires precision, sharp thinking, and a touch of finesse, the kind women often have to double-prove in a world still tilted towards men. I don't complain. I'm used to pushing through, back-to-back meetings, late replies to emails, and rushed lunches eaten over an open spreadsheet. From the outside, my life seemed fine. Richard, my husband, is a decent man. An electrical engineer at a large firm, quiet, proper, family-oriented. We met at university in Bath, married at 27, and had a son, Jamie, when I was 31. Everything unfolded like a textbook stable marriage, no drama, no drinking, no betrayal. But there was also little that made my heart skip a beat when I woke up in the morning. We had a 3-bedroom house, an electric hatchback, and weekends filled with swimming lessons and football practice. Our savings account was healthy enough not to worry. I still posted family photos on Facebook during the holidays, by the Christmas tree, on the beaches in Devon, at Jamie's youth football games. Friends commented, "Perfect family," and sometimes, I told myself the same. But what I never said out loud was this. I had been living like a woman operating her life like a machine. Wake up, make breakfast, drop off Jamie, go to work, pick him up, cook dinner, do dishes, sleep. Repeat. No mistakes. No detours. I never wanted to leave Richard. I never planned to be a single mum, or break up my family. But some days, I'd sit alone in my car after work, the radio playing softly, and feel a hollow space in my chest that no coffee, no book, no goodnight kiss could fill. And in that space, Mark appeared. I love Richard, in the way you love a partner, who's shared a decade of life with you. It's a love built on gratitude, stability, and a sense of duty. We didn't fight. There was no third party, at least not until recently. Richard isn't romantic, but he's kind. He changes the light bulbs, remembers Jamie's doctor appointments, and makes sure my car never runs out of petrol. We share family duties in a modern way. I cook, he cleans. I read to Jamie, he gives him his bath. Everything is fair, balanced, and yet, somehow, there's nothing left to long for. We shared a bed, but in recent months, even the bedtime hug had faded. Intimacy was rare. Some months, it didn't happen at all. No one said anything, and no one made a move. Sometimes I'd lie with my back to him, listening to his steady breathing, and wonder if I had grown old too quickly in this marriage. I tried to rekindle the connection, bought new nightwear, cooked a romantic Italian dinner, even made the first move on special occasions. But Richard was always tired after work, or stressed about a deadline. He never rejected me outright, but he didn't really want me either. Often I'd tell myself, this is normal. It happens after 10 years. But my heart didn't quite agree. We still went out to dinner, watched films, visited our parents. But the husband and wife part of us had begun to resemble polite flatmates. So polite, in fact, that we no longer dared to ask anything of each other. Each of us weary, quietly shelving our own needs just to keep the peace. Sometimes, I felt like we weren't living together, we were merely coexisting in a sealed box. And maybe that silent distance was what nudged me towards Mark. A man who, when he looked at me, made me feel like a woman again. Desirable, emotional, someone worth reaching for. I can't deny that the early years of our marriage were beautiful. Richard and I would talk for hours about the future, go on fun holidays, share quiet moments, just the two of us. But now they were only memories, fading, distant, untouchable. And memories alone couldn't fill the void I'd begun to feel. A kind of emptiness I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore either. It wasn't for lack of trying. I made so many efforts to keep the connection alive. I often brought up the old memories, the early dates, to remind Richard of that excitement. But as always, he'd just nod, then return to the hum of work and responsibility. Richard's world now was work and family, nothing more. He didn't see that I was missing something vital. Every time I tried to express how I felt, he'd say, "We're fine, Claire. Everything's fine." But that fine was just a blanket over indifference. Richard wasn't to blame, I knew that. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He simply didn't realize that I needed more than just fine. You see, I need to feel loved with passion, not just quietly accepted. Every morning, by the time I wake up, Richard has long gone to work. I look after Jamie, sort breakfast, take care of everything around the house, and yet, it feels like a part of me is slowly fading away. Sometimes I sit by the window in the afternoon, watching young couples stroll through the park, hand in hand, laughing together, and I wonder, can I ever feel that again? That feeling of truly being loved, of someone truly wanting to be by my side. Whenever we're together, especially after Jamie has gone to bed, it's like we're two old friends, people who used to love each other, but no longer know what to say. We lie next to each other, but there are no more warm embraces, no more late-night talks about dreams, not even any real passion when we're close. We're just two people sharing space, a bed, but lacking the most vital thing of all, connection. And day by day, that distance grows, making me feel increasingly lost in my own relationship. I don't know exactly when the feeling of not enough began creeping in, but once it appeared, everything else started to fade. I no longer felt important in Richard's eyes. And though I never wanted to admit it, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that something fundamental was missing from our marriage. I needed to feel like a woman again, not just a mother, not just a dutiful wife. That's when Mark came into the picture. Mark appeared on a Tuesday morning like a gust of fresh air, and strong, undeniable. I first met him during a large team meeting at the office, where a few of us were discussing upcoming project strategies. I'd heard his name before, but had never had the chance to speak to him directly. Mark was the managing director of a larger branch in the company, and I was just a consultant working on some of his financial projects. Truthfully, I wasn't expecting any sort of special connection between us. But when our eyes met across the meeting table, I felt something different. He wasn't the kind of man I usually paid attention to. Mark was tall, solidly built, with bright eyes, confident, but also sincere. He wasn't the stereotypical, perfect man, not someone in expensive suits, with an icy air about him. But there was something incredibly magnetic about him. When he spoke, his voice was warm and persuasive, and I couldn't look away. After that meeting, we began talking more regularly. At first, it was just brief exchanges about work, but slowly, personal stories began to slip in. I discovered Mark had a great sense of humor, that he was a good listener, and that he genuinely cared about what I had to say. Conversations with him felt light and effortless, and I felt seen. One afternoon, after a tense meeting, we happened to sit down together in the office cafe. We started off discussing work issues with the project, timelines, deadlines. But then Mark asked about my family, my interests, the things I loved outside of work. He was curious, genuine, and I began to feel a connection I couldn't ignore. His questions weren't the polite, routine sort. He really wanted to understand me. "You work so hard, Claire. Do you ever take time for yourself?" he asked, his voice gentle, full of understanding. That was a question Richard had never asked me. And it hit me, I had never truly stopped to think about myself, about what I wanted beyond caring for my family and fulfilling my job. From then on, our meetings became more natural. Sometimes a quick email chat, then occasional coffee after work. Every time I was with Mark, I felt something shift, something I hadn't felt in years with Richard. We began sharing very personal things. He told me about past struggles, about a relationship that ended because of work, and failures in his career he'd had to face. His stories made me feel a deep empathy. He wasn't perfect, and that imperfection made him feel so real, so human, so close. Then, one late evening after another difficult meeting, we shared a glass of wine at a bar near the office. We didn't talk about family, work, or stress. We simply sat there, looked at each other in the soft, dim light, and the world seemed to vanish. I couldn't explain how I felt. Everything just unfolded naturally. And then, Mark touched my hand. In that moment, I couldn't pull away. The feeling was intense, magnetic, like an invitation I couldn't refuse. The moment I realized I could no longer think of Mark as just a colleague, I knew I had stepped into unfamiliar territory. It was a feeling I had never experienced in all my years of marriage with Richard, but one that came so clearly, so powerfully, with Mark. When I sat across from him in those late-night talks about work or life, everything else, responsibilities, family, even old emotions, faded into the background. At first, I kept telling myself it was just a harmless infatuation, that I was only drawn to him because he was different from what I had. But every time we spoke, something inside me stirred. Every time he smiled, it was like a current ran through me. And when he looked at me with those attentive, searching eyes, I began to realize this wasn't just admiration. It was love, new, overwhelming, and confusing. There were moments when I came home, standing beside Richard in the kitchen as we prepared dinner, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. His touches, the casual strokes, the routine affection, no longer warmed me. I could only think of Mark. I knew it was wrong, that I shouldn't feel this way. But the emotions were uncontrollable. I won't deny that I felt guilty for thinking about another man, for feeling such strong emotions for Mark. I kept telling myself I had to stop, to return to reality, to focus on my family and the responsibilities I had chosen. But every time we met, every time he looked at me with those eyes, I felt as though I couldn't pull away. One evening, after meeting to discuss a project, we stayed and talked again, this time not about work, but about personal things. He asked about the things I loved, about the things I regret in life, and about the dreams I haven't fulfilled. I could no longer hold back my emotions. "Claire, have you ever thought that sometimes we need to do something different?" Mark asked, his voice low, heavy with meaning. I looked into his eyes and suddenly, I couldn't lie anymore. My feelings had completely changed. I couldn't stop thinking about him. What I felt for Mark was intense and indescribable, and I began to wonder if I could continue living in a relationship with Richard when my heart was drawn to someone else. That was the moment I knew I had gone too far. I couldn't turn back, but I also couldn't move forward without consequences. I knew I was on the edge of a decision that would change everything, but at that moment, I could only feel one thing, the strong pull toward Mark. We said nothing more for the rest of the evening. Just a heavy, tense silence. And when I stepped out of the cafe, I didn't know what I would face after that day. But one thing was certain, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. We had talked about meeting a few times over email, but the right opportunity never came. Then, one Thursday night, Mark sent me a short but suggestive message. "Claire, would you like to grab a coffee? Tonight feels like a good time to relax." There was no reason to say no. His words stirred something in me, a flutter of anticipation, like I knew this would change everything. I said yes without thinking too much, only aware of my heart beating a little faster. We met at a small cafe near downtown, a place where I could feel the quiet and the intimacy. At that moment, nothing bound us anymore, not work, not duty. Mark and I were no longer just colleagues in meetings, but two entirely different people, stepping outside the usual rules. When I entered, Mark was already waiting in the corner, his face softly lit by the dim lamps. He looked different, not the stiff man in a business suit, but someone completely free, relaxed in a rolled-up shirt, his face attentive. When he saw me, he smiled, and that smile sent a jolt through me. "Hi Claire," he said, his voice gentle and warm. "You look beautiful tonight." That compliment made me feel like a different person, like I hadn't felt that kind of attention in a long time. I sat down, and we began to talk. At first, we chatted about simple things, work, future projects, the weather. But I noticed our conversation wasn't like ordinary ones anymore. We weren't just discussing objective matters, but sharing personal things. He asked me about my hobbies, about the dreams I hadn't dared to pursue, about the struggles I'd been through. And I couldn't help it. I began to open up to him, sharing what I had missed in my marriage. "Have you ever felt trapped in the familiar, in the choices you've made?" he asked, his eyes looking deeply into mine, making it impossible for me to look away. That question hit something inside me. I suddenly realized that what I felt for Mark wasn't just fleeting attraction. He made me feel understood and cared for in a way I hadn't experienced from Richard in years. After a while, our conversation drifted beyond the ordinary. When he gently placed his hand on mine on the table, I didn't pull away. I just looked at him in silence. Time seemed to stop. We didn't need to say anything more. His gaze held mine, and I felt something profound in it, not just desire, but a quiet connection between two people. "Claire," he whispered, his voice brushing my ear, "can you feel this? We could really be something more." Those words sent a sweet, swirling sensation through me. We were standing at the edge of something, and if we took one more step, we couldn't go back. But the pull between us, the intensity of it, was unstoppable. For a moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to stop myself, and then Mark kissed me. That kiss wasn't just a brush of lips. It was an explosion of emotion, the fulfillment of every longing I had suppressed for too long. It was fiery, passionate, unforgettable. When we pulled apart, I found myself breathless, and his eyes still held that challenge, that deep attraction. I knew I couldn't go back, and that everything was now beginning to change. After that first meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. What I felt for him wasn't just temporary desire, it was a deep connection I had never experienced in all the years I was married to Richard. Even though I knew it was wrong, even though I felt guilty, my heart kept pulling me toward those moments with Mark. And I couldn't deny that I began to look forward to seeing him again. We decided to meet more often, secret meetings that no one else knew about. Each time felt like we were slipping into our own private world, where there was no judgment, no responsibilities, only raw and unfiltered emotions. Every time I saw him, I felt alive again, like the long years of exhaustion in my marriage had made me forget what truly mattered. We usually met on weekends, when work was over and no one would suspect anything. One evening, after dinner at a small restaurant, Mark took me to a nearby park. There were no crowds, no noise, just soft darkness and empty paths. We walked together, and this time, there were no casual talks about work or daily life. Our conversation had grown deeper, more intimate. "What do you think about your life right now?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. I felt like I couldn't lie to him anymore, my true emotions were beginning to overflow. "I think I'm living a life I don't really want. I want to feel alive, to feel free and passionate, like I do when I'm with you," I replied, my voice trembling but certain. I knew I was opening my heart, but I couldn't stop. Mark stopped and looked into my eyes, then gently took my hand. "Then why don't you let me be the one to make you feel that way? We can live the life we want, Claire. No one can stop that." That one sentence was enough to make all my barriers crumble. I no longer felt afraid. I had stepped into a new world, one where my emotions could flow freely, without doubt or fear. Day by day, our meetings grew more intense. We no longer met only at night, but also stole moments during lunch breaks or early mornings before work began. Every moment together was an adventure, and in those hours, I forgot everything. I forgot about responsibilities, about Richard, about everything I once knew. One evening, after a particularly tense encounter, we returned to Mark's apartment. There were no more words, no more defenses. Only waves of uncontrollable emotions. We made love passionately, as if it were the last time we ever could. Every time he touched me, every time our lips met, I felt like I was living in a world where only he and I existed. We didn't talk about the consequences of what we were doing. We didn't think about the future. We just lived in the present, just emotions, passion, and something we couldn't stop. I started to realize I was going too far, but I couldn't turn back. My feelings for Mark grew stronger by the day. I couldn't deny that this relationship was changing me, making me feel alive again. And even though I knew I was diving deep into something dangerous, I couldn't stop. While Mark and I continued our passionate encounters, a sense of unease constantly lingered inside me, like a hidden shadow I couldn't escape. Every time I looked into Mark's eyes, I felt submerged in something uncontrollable. But every time I thought of Richard, my husband, my heart ached. He didn't deserve what I was doing. The guilt always surrounded me, especially when I returned home. Every morning waking up beside Richard, looking into his eyes, I felt like I was carrying a terrible secret, a betrayal I couldn't admit. He still loved me, still cared for me as he always had, and I felt like I was lying not just to him, but to myself. One weekend morning, as I sat sipping my coffee, thoughts of my relationship with Mark came flooding back. That haunting feeling wouldn't let go, and I began to question whether any of this was worth it. Was I destroying everything I'd built with Richard just for a fleeting feeling? Something romantic and intense with Mark. The feeling was like a crashing wave, sweeping away all logic. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, sitting beside me, his eyes filled with concern. Though he didn't know about my secret meetings, I felt as if he somehow sensed something. I didn't know how to respond. Lying had become harder, especially as I felt this web of secrets slowly tearing our relationship apart. Every time I looked at Mark, what I felt wasn't just passion. I felt pain, risk, danger. I knew I was walking down a road with no way out, but my heart couldn't stop. Each time we met, each time he touched me, all the conflict inside me seemed to disappear, leaving only desire, the need to be near him. But after each goodbye, I returned to emptiness. "Claire, do you really think you can just walk away?" Mark asked one night as we lay together, his fingers gently brushing my hair. He knew I was torn, but he wouldn't let go. He wanted me to stay, to keep this going. "I don't know anymore, Mark," I sighed, my voice full of exhaustion. "I can't keep living with this. I'm hurting Richard. He doesn't deserve this." Mark didn't reply immediately. He just looked at me in silence, as if waiting for me to find the answer myself. Those silent moments made me feel even more trapped in my own emotional chaos. I couldn't stop, but I couldn't keep going either. Part of me wanted to walk away and return to my family. But another part couldn't let go of what I felt when I was with Mark. "So do you really want to stop?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. "If you do, just say so. But do you really want that?" That question wasn't just a challenge, it was a pull, pushing me deeper into my own confusion. How could I give up a feeling I'd never had before, just to return to the dull, false stability of my current life? But I also knew that if I kept going down this path, everything would eventually fall apart. When I returned home, Richard was still there, calm as always, but that sense of peace was no longer within me. I couldn't forget the sweet moments with Mark, couldn't erase the waves of passion he brought. But I also couldn't go on living with this guilt. Everything started to collapse on a stormy day. Richard and I had spent the previous week in near silence. Our relationship was no longer the same, and I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at my mind. Though he hadn't directly confronted me, I sensed a change in Richard's behavior. He was quieter, more distant. His eyes, when he looked at me, seemed to search for something I could no longer hide. That morning, as I was preparing for an important meeting, Richard suddenly said, "Are you hiding something from me?" His voice was cold and tense. He stood in the bedroom doorway, holding my phone, his eyes locked on mine. My whole body froze, my heart pounded. I knew immediately he had found something, but I never expected it to happen so soon. Richard had never paid attention to my phone before, he always trusted me, always believed I was a loyal wife. But today, everything had changed. What are you talking about?" I tried to keep calm, though anxiety was rising like a storm inside me. Richard didn't answer. He simply held the phone out toward me. On the screen were messages between me and Mark. Sweet words. Conversations far beyond friendship. Everything was crystal clear. "I don't know what I'm doing with this marriage anymore. But now I know everything, Claire," Richard said. His voice was no longer soft, it was cold as ice. A glacier river. He put the phone down on the table and turned away, his shoulders slumped as if enduring a pain I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't say anything. I just stood there, silent, watching everything I had shattered. Guilt-ridden words echoed in my mind, "Will you forgive me?" But I knew things could never go back to the way they were. What I had done was inexcusable. "What do you want to say?" Richard turned back to face me, his eyes red, not from tears, but from an anger that couldn't be suppressed. I'm sorry, Richard. I know I was wrong. I tried to speak, but even as I said the words, I felt they couldn't change a thing. They were too late. It's too late, Claire, Richard said, his voice colder than ever. You've hurt me too much. But I can't bear this feeling of betrayal. He stood in silence for a long time before finally sighing, as though giving up all hope. I can't keep living like this. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But you also know I can't stay and live with someone who's betrayed me. His words cut through my heart like a blade. I loved him, but I had gotten swept into something I couldn't pull myself out of. In a moment, I felt the sharp fracture of our relationship. It was like a dangerous game that had spiraled out of my control. Richard gave me one final look, then turned away. His footsteps faded, leaving me alone in a cold room, consumed by emptiness and guilt. I couldn't say another word. I couldn't fix anything anymore. The air in the house felt suffocated. Richard's heavy sighs, the tapping of my fingers on the table, all of it dissolved into a silent, heavy space, like a courtroom where emotions had been laid bare and could never be taken back. Richard stood there, his hand clenched, as if he wanted to crush the phone I had once secretly used to contact Mark. He still said nothing, but his face was full of anger and disgust, as though everything he had once trusted was now a lie. You think I didn't know? Richard finally spoke, not a question, but a furious declaration. He turned fully to face me, his eyes no longer gentle. For a whole month, you met with Mark behind my back. And I was the fool who believed everything was fine. Did you think I wouldn't notice? I wanted to explain, but every word I tried to form got stuck in my throat. Guilt weighed on me like an anchor. Every word he said was a blow to my heart. I looked at him, but I couldn't find any justification for what I'd done. You wouldn't understand, Richard, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though my chest roiled with turmoil. I didn't mean to hurt you. But what I felt with Mark, it was completely different from anything I ever had with you. Different. Richard spat each word. So you thought you could toy with my feelings, and his, and there'd be no consequences. He curled his lip, his eyes like stormy seas. You think I'd forgive you? After everything you've done? He raised his hand, as if he couldn't bear to hear another word. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and the weight of irreversible consequences. Do you really think you can keep living like this? Richard went on, his voice rising, full of pain he couldn't hide. And you think this was just a mistake? You were a deceitful wife, playing both sides, and you expect forgiveness. He shouted, his voice crashing like thunder, shattering all the emotions I had tried to suppress. Every word, though drenched in rage, made me feel like a traitor, unworthy of redemption. I had hurt him. I had brought us to this breaking point. Richard, I'm sorry. I truly am, I stammered, but perhaps the apology no longer meant anything. They were just empty words, unable to change the truth. I was wrong, I know. But I can't undo it. Richard looked at me for a long time, his eyes empty. He didn't cry, didn't yell again, but the sadness in his eyes was like an undertow, deep, quiet, powerful. I don't know how much longer I can live with a wife like you, he said softly, his voice filled with pain. If you love him, then go, Claire. But if not, take a hard look and ask yourself if there's anything left we can still save. Those words cut deeper than anything before. I didn't know how to respond. What I had done was beyond obvious, and there was no going back to fix all that had broken. The love between Richard and me, it had crumbled because of a mistake that could never be forgiven. I can't. I whispered, tears running down my cheeks. I can't do it, Richard. But I can't live like this either. Richard walked away in silence, without a final word. I stood there, alone in a house I once thought was the safest place in the world, now filled only with emptiness and wounds that would never heal. Everything felt broken beyond repair. All I had left were bitter memories that couldn't be erased. I sat on the bed, staring at the phone, unable to bring myself to call Mark. The whole day, I sat there in silence, my sighs dissolving into the emptiness of the room. Everything was blurred. I'd spent the past days tortured, unable to find a way out. I loved Mark, but I also loved Richard. I didn't know if there was anything left to save in this marriage. But one thing I knew for sure, I couldn't keep living in lies. Richard had made it clear. He had run out of patience. He said if I wanted to stay, I had to choose clearly. If you still love me, then you'll stay. It wasn't a plea, it was an ultimatum. Either I came back, or I left. But if I left, would I really be happy with Mark? Did he love me the way I loved him? Or was it just a momentary escape? I couldn't be sure. Sometimes, I asked myself if the love with Mark was even real. Was it sharp and sincere, or just a way to fill the void I had neglected in my relationship with Richard? I stood up, my legs feeling weak. For the first time in days, I fully realized I was facing a truth I could no longer deny. I have to make a decision, I whispered to myself. I can't keep living in this fear. I walked toward the living room door, where Richard was still sitting in silence. He hadn't asked me anything else after our argument, but his face said it all. As for me, I felt a profound sadness. Part of me wanted to run to Mark, but another part of me couldn't leave Richard, the man who had always loved me, always believed in me. He deserved my full love, not my indecision and lies. I turned to look at Richard. He looked up, his eyes tired and filled with pain. I could see the exhaustion, the hopelessness I had caused him. I sat down beside him, my hand brushing his gently, as if seeking comfort. Richard, I began, my voice soft but full of resolve. I can't go on living like this. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo everything. But I also can't live in this lie. He said nothing, just looked at me. A long silence passed before I continued. I love you, Richard. But I can't go on living with this doubt and guilt. I need to face this, once and for all. I took a deep breath, looking into his eyes, trying to find forgiveness there. Richard didn't look away, but he didn't smile either. He simply sighed, and finally, he said something that made my heart sink. If that's how you feel, then go, Claire. Do what you feel is right. His voice wasn't bitter, just accepting. But that was the worst thing I could have heard, the acceptance of a man who had given up hope. I stood up, my heart shattered. It felt like the whole world was collapsing in front of me, but I knew I had to make this choice. As for Mark, I wasn't sure. I couldn't push Richard out of my life, just because of a fleeting emotion. I turned back to look at him one more time, then sighed and made my decision. I'm staying, Richard. I'll try. I won't let you down again. Richard didn't say anything more. He only nodded slightly, but I knew that from that moment on, things would never be the same again. The love I had for him had been fractured, no matter how hard I tried. Things changed quickly after I made my decision. In the first few days after choosing to stay with Richard, I felt a strange quietness in the air of our home. Not the silence of peace, but of things left unsaid, of a feeling I couldn't name. Richard had accepted my decision, but in his eyes, I saw no relief, only a hollow emptiness, as if he had lost faith in me, even though I was right there beside him. Each morning when I woke up, I realized our life had changed. The little conversations between us now felt distant, as if every word had to cross an invisible wall. We no longer spent evenings together, sharing stories of our day, no more thoughtful questions, no more playful laughter. I felt like I had lost myself in this marriage, as if I was living in a relationship that was only a shadow of what it once was. Even though I chose to stay, it wasn't because I still loved Richard the way I used to. My decision wasn't about saving a fading love. It was about avoiding the consequences of the deception I had created. I wanted to preserve the stability of our family, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. Every time I went to work, my heart ached with thoughts of him. Despite my efforts, I couldn't stop picturing our secret meetings, the burning glances we shared, the sweet kisses that still haunted me. I couldn't erase him from my mind, no matter how busy I kept with work, family life, and the conversations I still tried to maintain with Richard. Mark remained a part of my thoughts, a temptation I couldn't resist. He was the one who awakened real emotions in me, who made me feel alive after long, grey days. Even though I had chosen Richard, I knew I couldn't pretend what I had with Mark never happened. That weekend, Richard and I took a walk in the park near our house, the same park we used to go to in the early days of our love. I tried to smile, tried to spark light conversations, but everything felt forced. I sensed the distance between us, not just in our words, but in the smallest gestures. When we stopped by a lake, I felt a strange weariness wash over me. I looked at Richard's face and knew he felt I was no longer the woman he once loved. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, his eyes filled with concern, but I could see the fear behind them. He was afraid. Afraid I no longer loved him. And I knew he had every reason to feel that way. "I'm okay," I replied, but I knew it was a lie. I wasn't okay. I couldn't escape the sense of loss and guilt, couldn't escape the feelings I still had for Mark, even though I had promised to stay with Richard. The days that followed were filled with contradiction. Each time I looked into Richard's eyes, I wondered if I was even capable of loving him the way I once had. Could I truly forget Mark? Or would I forever carry this sense of separation in my heart? My feelings for Richard hadn't vanished overnight. But I also knew that, even as I stayed, I would always carry a sense of incompleteness inside me. And that, perhaps, was something I would have to live with for the rest of my life.